I almost didn't notice him the first time. That's the part that still unsettles me. The idea that danger can walk into a room wearing a perfectly pressed suit, smelling of cedarwood and something darker underneath, and your body registers the threat before your mind does. My hands knew before I did. They trembled slightly as I poured the water, the crystal pitcher catching the low amber light of the private dining room, and a small voice somewhere deep in my chest whispered, "Be careful." I ignored it, the way I always ignored things that made me feel too much. My name is Ava. I have been cleaning other people's beautiful things for 3 years. Polishing marble countertops I will never own, folding linen sheets I will never sleep in, moving through rooms like a ghost no one bothers to acknowledge. It is not a life I dreamed of, but it is mine, and I have learned to find small dignities in it. The particular satisfaction of a spotless surface, the silence of an empty hallway in the early morning, the way sunlight moves through expensive glass like it belongs to no one and everyone at once. I worked for a staffing agency that placed domestic workers in high-end households and private events across the city. That Thursday, they sent me to Nobu, though not the public restaurant, the private floor, accessible only by a separate elevator that required a keycard. I had worked events like this before. Corporate dinners, discreet celebrations, the kind of gatherings where men in beautiful clothes spoke in low voices about things they would never say in front of cameras. I was not supposed to observe. I was supposed to be invisible. The room was arranged with 4 circular tables, each seating 2. Fresh orchids, candles that smelled of black amber, a pianist playing something melancholy in the corner. I noticed the security immediately. 2 men near the entrance who were too still, too alert, their eyes moving in patterns rather than wandering the way ordinary people's eyes do. A third stood just outside the hallway. None of them wore uniforms. All of them wore earpieces. And then I noticed the man they surrounded. He was younger than I expected. That was the first thing. His youth, startling against the authority he carried without effort or announcement. Korean, with the kind of face that belonged in a different context entirely. Something quieter and less complicated than whatever this was. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that absorbed the room in unhurried sweeps. Black suit, perfectly fitted, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat. And there, climbing from beneath the fabric, curling up his neck in elaborate dark ink, tattoos that told a different story than the elegance of everything else about him. His name, I would learn later, was Youngjae. But that night, I did not know his name. I only knew the way the room shifted when he moved through it. The way other people, the other guests, the staff who had been here longer than me, became slightly more careful in his presence. The pianist, without any visible signal, transitioned to something softer. The man near the door straightened almost imperceptibly. I kept my eyes down. This was a skill I had spent years perfecting. The evening's arrangement became clear as the guests arrived. 4 women, each escorted to a separate table. Each woman was beautiful in a distinct way. One in red, confident and practiced in her elegance. One in emerald silk, younger, nervous beneath her smile. One in white, who moved as though she had always expected rooms to arrange themselves around her. And the 4th table remained empty for a long while, which I noticed only because I had been asked to maintain all 4 place settings equally. Youngji sat at a 5th table, slightly apart, with a clear sightline to all 4. Beside his plate rested a glass of water he barely touched, and a small leather folio I was instructed never to approach. I understood, gradually, that this was not a dinner party in any conventional sense. An hour in, one of his men, the one with the slight scar below his ear, moved between the 4 women's tables, presenting each with a slim envelope. I was close enough to the 2nd table to hear the small sound the woman in emerald made when she opened hers. Not quite a gasp. Something more restrained than that, but unmistakable. I didn't see what was inside, I was already moving to refill a water glass. What I did notice was Young Jae watching. Not the women. Not exactly. He was watching their reactions. His expression gave away nothing, but his attention was total, the way a very still body of water contains enormous depth. One finger rested lightly against his jaw. He did not smile. He only watched. The woman in red laughed and said something in a low voice to the man who had delivered her envelope. The woman in white examined her envelope's contents with the practiced neutrality of someone who has received expensive gifts before and knows how to appear appropriately unsurprised. The young woman in emerald pressed her lips together and stared at the table. By the time the dinner concluded and the guests began departing, I had nearly forgotten the evening's strangeness. I was focused on clearing the orchid centerpiece from the first table when I heard a sound that did not belong. A small, sharp impact. Glass on marble. I turned without thinking. The crystal water glass I had set at the empty fourth table, the one that had never been occupied, had tipped. A slow spread of water moved across the white linen. I reached for it quickly, pressing my service cloth to the tablecloth, and in doing so I stepped back and collided, solidly, with something behind me. Not something. Someone. The impact was enough to send the small leather folio I had been warned never to approach skidding from the edge of a nearby stand, scattering its contents across the floor. Several envelopes. A single black card, matte and heavy, unlike anything I had ever held. I dropped to my knees immediately, gathering everything with shaking hands. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't see. The room had gone very quiet. I looked up. Young Jae stood above me. Close. Closer than I had ever been to someone who carried this particular quality of danger, and I understood in that moment that danger did not always announce itself with raised voices or visible weapons. Sometimes it arrived in perfect stillness, in the measured way a man looked down at you from a great height, not in physical stature, though he was tall, but in some other dimension entirely, one that had nothing to do with furniture or floors. His dark eyes moved from my face to the scattered envelopes to the black card now in my hand. I had not meant to pick it up. My fingers had acted on instinct, gathering everything within reach. "Stand up," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, accented in a way that made each word feel chosen rather than automatic. I stood. The card was still in my hand. I held it out to him immediately, my arm steady through sheer willpower, because everything else inside me was not. He did not take it right away. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that does not catalog appearance but catalogs something else, something I did not have a name for. Then his gaze moved to the card, then back to my face. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ava," I said. "I work for the agency. I'm very sorry about the folio. Nothing is damaged. I made sure..." "Ava." He repeated it as though testing its weight. Not unkindly. Not warmly either. Simply as a fact being filed somewhere. He took the card from my hand. His fingers brushed mine for less than a second. The contact was nothing. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. And yet I felt it travel up my arm and settle somewhere near my sternum, strange and unwelcome. "The glass," he said. "I'll replace the linen immediately." "No." He glanced at the overturned glass, then back at me. "The fourth table was supposed to remain untouched. Who told you to set it?" I blinked. "The event coordinator. She said 4 tables, 4 full settings." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something more internal than that. He opened the leather folio, glanced inside, and closed it with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to controlling whatever reaction they allowed themselves. Then he looked at me again. "Go home," he said. "The agency will receive your payment." He turned away before I could respond. His security moved with him, the 3 men reshaping themselves around his trajectory, as naturally as water moving around stone. Within moments, the room contained only the pianist, now silent, the remaining staff, and me, standing beside a wet tablecloth with the distinct sensation that something had just begun that I did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. I gathered my things. I signed out at the coordinator's station. I took the elevator down to the ground floor and stepped into the cold night air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, an unknown number, a message containing only 3 lines. Tomorrow. 9 a.m., 14 Harwick Place. Come alone. The city noise continued around me. Taxis, voices, the distant percussion of a city that did not stop for anyone. I read the message 3 times. My thumb hovered over the screen. I should have deleted it. I didn't. 14. Harwick Place was not what I expected. I had spent the night constructing versions of it in my mind. A warehouse, perhaps, or one of those glass towers downtown where certain kinds of men conducted certain kinds of business behind frosted doors and unmarked lobbies. What I found instead, at precisely 9 in the morning, was a townhouse on a quiet, tree-lined street, where the buildings were old and well-maintained, and the silence had a particular quality. The kind that comes not from emptiness, but from careful arrangement. Someone had ensured this street remained calm. The absence of noise here felt intentional. I stood on the pavement for longer than I should have. My coat was my good one, charcoal wool, slightly worn at the left cuff, and I had told myself that morning, while dressing, that I was only going to decline in person. That it was safer to say no face-to-face than to ignore a message from a man surrounded by armed security. That this was practical reasoning, not something else. I was lying to myself, but I was doing it very neatly. A man appeared at the top of the townhouse steps before I reached them. Not young Jay, one of the security team, the one with the scar below his ear. He said nothing, only held the door open, and something about the gesture, its absolute lack of warmth, its complete efficiency, told me that arguing with it would accomplish nothing. I went inside. The interior was the opposite of the event space from the previous night, where Nobu's private floor had been theatrical. Orchids, candlelight, calculated atmosphere. This was spare. Expensive in the way that required no announcement. Dark wood floors, high ceilings. A painting on the far wall that I recognized, distantly, as the kind of work that belonged in institutions rather than homes. The air smelled of coffee and, underneath it, that same cedarwood darkness I had registered the night before, and then spent several hours trying not to think about. I was shown to a sitting room off the main hallway. The man with the scar left without speaking. I sat. I waited 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone with the particular attention of someone who needs an anchor, and counting seconds was the only anchor available to me. Then young Jay came in. He was less formally dressed than the night before. Dark trousers, a charcoal sweater with the sleeves pushed to his forearms, revealing the edges of the ink that covered more of his skin than the open collar had suggested. He carried 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of me without asking whether I wanted it. He sat across from me, and for a moment he simply looked at me with those dark, unhurried eyes, and I had the unnerving sense that he had already decided several things before entering the room. "You're wondering why you're here," he said. "Yes. And you came anyway." It wasn't a question, but it felt like one. Or rather, it felt like an observation that contained a question inside it, the way certain boxes have hidden compartments. I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup to give them something to do. "You didn't seem like someone it was wise to ignore," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. "Last night," he said, "there were 4 women at 4 tables. Each received an envelope containing a credit card. No limit. No oversight. linked to an account that will not be traced back to anything they need to concern themselves with. He paused. They were given 2 weeks. I looked at him. 2 weeks to do what? To spend it. However they chose. He turned his coffee cup once in his hand, a small, precise rotation. I needed to understand something about each of them. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street and was absorbed back into the deliberate silence of the neighborhood. I don't understand what this has to do with me, I said. I'm not one of those women. I work for a staffing agency. I poured water and cleared centerpieces. You knocked over a glass, he said, and in gathering what fell, you picked up the 5th card. I stared at him. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, which he wore despite the sweater, which I realized meant he was never truly without it, and placed something on the low table between us. A card. Matte black. No name, no number visible on the surface. Heavier than a normal card looked like it should be. My card. The one I had accidentally held for 30 seconds on a marble floor. I don't want that, I said, and I was proud of how level my voice came out. You haven't heard the terms. I don't need to. I'm a housekeeper. Whatever this is, I'm not the right person for it. He regarded me with an expression I could not fully read, and that inability unsettled me more than a readable expression would have. A man who lets you see his reactions is a man who has decided you are not a threat. A man whose face reveals only what he chooses to reveal is something else entirely. The women I selected, he said carefully, were chosen because they exist in a particular proximity to my world. Each of them has a connection I needed to examine. What a person purchases when given unlimited resources and zero accountability tells me more than any conversation could. He glanced at the card on the table. You were not selected. What happened was an accident. But I am someone who pays attention to accidents. Why? Because accidents reveal what arrangements conceal. He leaned back slightly. You held that card for 30 seconds. You gathered everything else first. The envelopes, the folio, and that card was the last thing you picked up. When you offered it back, your arm was steady. Most people in that position are not steady. I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. I want to add a 5th participant, he said. You would have the same card, the same 2 weeks, the same complete freedom to spend as you choose. At the end, I want to know one thing: what you bought and why. The coffee in front of me had stopped steaming. I looked at it. And if I say no? I asked. Then you leave. The agency receives a bonus for last night's event. You go back to your life. He said it without inflection, which somehow made it worse. Not a threat, simply a statement of what the world would look like in that direction. What happens to the women? I asked, after the 2 weeks. Something moved behind his eyes. That depends on what they choose. It was not, I noticed, an answer. I looked at the card on the table. Matte black, catching no light, giving nothing back. I thought about my apartment. The radiator that worked only when it wanted to. The leak above the bathroom window I had reported 3 times. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter that I shuffled like a card game I could never win. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone last Sunday, carefully not asking whether I was managing. I thought about the 11 minutes I had sat in this room waiting, and how I had not left. 2 weeks, I said. 2 weeks. And this is, what? A test of character? It is a test of nature, he said. Character can be performed, nature cannot. I reached out and picked up the card. It was heavier than it looked. I turned it once in my fingers, the way he had turned his coffee cup, and I set it in my coat pocket and picked up my coffee because suddenly I needed something warm and ordinary. He watched me do all of this. He watched the way people watch things they are genuinely interested in, but have trained themselves not to reach toward. You'll have questions, he said. I have about 40 of them right now. Save them." He stood, which signaled that the meeting was over in the way that only certain men can signal such things. Not rudely, but with a finality that the room itself seemed to recognize. "You have my number." "I have a number," I said. "I don't know that it's yours." He looked at me, and this time the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was slightly more than before, slightly less controlled, and it was gone so quickly I almost doubted it. "It's mine," he said. The man with the scar appeared at the doorway. I did not hear him approach, which meant he had been very close for some time. And I was shown back through the dark floored hallway, past the painting that belonged in a museum, and out into the cold morning air of a street that had been arranged to stay quiet. I walked to the corner before I stopped. The card was a solid weight in my pocket. I pressed my palm flat against my coat, feeling it through the wool, and stood there while a woman walked past with a small dog and a delivery truck rumbled by, and the city continued its indifferent motion. 2 weeks. I had no idea what I was going to do with an unlimited credit card. That was the honest truth. I had spent so long calculating every purchase, weighing every small expenditure against every other small expenditure, that the concept of no limit produced something close to vertigo. It was like being told the ground had been removed, not dangerously, simply structurally. The thing I had always used to orient myself was gone. I took the bus home. I sat with the card in my pocket, and my hands folded in my lap, and my eyes on the middle distance, and I thought about what young Jay had said. Nature cannot be performed. I thought about the woman in red, who had laughed. The woman in white, whose expression had not changed. The young woman in emerald who had pressed her lips together and stared at the table, as though the envelope contained something that required grieving. I wondered what they were buying. That night, I cleaned my apartment. Really cleaned it, the way I cleaned other people's spaces, with attention and care. And I sat at my kitchen table with the black card in front of me, and a notepad and a pen. I wrote at the top of the page, "What do I actually need?" Then I sat there for a long time. The radiator clicked and hissed. The window above the bathroom let in a thin draft I had learned to ignore. The stack of bills sat at the edge of my vision, patient and immovable. I wrote one thing below the question. Then I put the pen down and looked at it for a long while. Then I picked up my phone, because there was a call I'd been putting off for 6 weeks, and some decisions, once you see them clearly, cannot wait any longer. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you something." Outside, the city went on without me, and in my pocket, transferred now to the table, then back to my hand, the matte black card sat in my palm like an answer to a question I hadn't known I'd been asking. I didn't feel powerful, holding it. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was about to find out what I was actually made of. The first thing I bought was a plane ticket. Not for me, for my mother, who had not left the town she was born in for 11 years, who worked double shifts at a laundromat 4 days a week and spent the remaining 3 caring for my grandmother, whose memory had been quietly retreating for the past 2 years, like a tide going out. I bought my mother a round-trip ticket from Raleigh to New York, and then I booked her into a hotel 3 blocks from my apartment. Nothing extravagant, but clean and warm and entirely her own. And I paid 3 months of a professional caregiver's salary to arrange coverage for my grandmother while she was away. It took me 4 hours to do all of this. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and the black card, and I moved through each transaction with the careful deliberateness of someone dismantling something fragile, because that is what it felt like. Dismantling the architecture of worry I had built around my family over years, piece by careful piece. When it was done, I sat back in my chair, and the kitchen was very quiet, and I noticed my face was wet. I hadn't realized I was crying. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked at the ceiling and thought, This is what relief feels like when you have not felt it in so long you forgot the texture of it. Then I made a list of everything else. My grandmother's specialist visits had a gap, a particular assessment her primary doctor had recommended for 18 months that the insurance kept finding reasons to delay. I scheduled it, and I paid it. And I sat on the phone for 40 minutes navigating the administrative maze of it with a patience I could afford. Because for the first time, the obstacle was not money, but only bureaucracy, which is exhausting but survivable. I paid off the remaining balance on my mother's car. I bought a new radiator part. Not the whole unit, just the component a repairman had told me 2 years ago would fix the problem. The one I had written down and never purchased because the timing was never right. I ordered it online and scheduled an installation. I did not buy anything for myself for the first 5 days. This was not a conscious decision exactly. Or rather, it was the kind of decision that hides inside instinct, that wears the clothing of habit. I had spent so long placing myself last in every calculation that the pattern continued, even when the mathematics had changed entirely. On the 6th day, I received a message. Not from the unknown number. From the agency. A new placement. A private residence. The kind of job that came with an address in a part of the city where doormen wore uniforms, and the lobbies smelled of fresh flowers replaced daily. I almost declined. But the rent was not going to pause for my strange 2-week interlude, and the card in my pocket was not mine to keep, and I had not entirely lost my grip on that particular reality. The address was in the Harwick district, 3 streets from the townhouse with dark floors and a painting that belonged in a museum. I noticed this and told myself it meant nothing. The residence was a penthouse, the kind that occupies an entire floor and refers to its rooms by their orientations. The north sitting room, the east study, as though the compass is a reasonable way to navigate one's home. I was there to deep clean ahead of a private dinner the following evening. The usual protocol. No personal items disturbed, no closed doors opened, work within the agreed areas, be finished and gone before 4. I was cleaning the kitchen. Extraordinary kitchen. The kind designed more for the statement of having it than for regular use. Though someone had been using it, there were marks of genuine habitation when I heard the elevator. In a residence like that, the elevator opened directly into the entry hall. I heard the doors, and then footsteps, and then a voice I recognized with a physical response that moved through me before I could intercept it. A tightening across the shoulders, a new alertness in the room, as though the air itself recalibrated. I set down the cloth I was holding. Young Jay appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw me. Something crossed his face, quickly, replaced almost instantly by his usual contained expression. But I had been watching people long enough to catch what moved beneath the surface of composed faces. And what I saw was surprise. Genuine surprise, which meant this was not arranged, which meant the universe had a particular sense of humor I was not entirely prepared for. Behind him, partially visible in the hallway, one of his security team waited with the practiced invisibility of people paid to be present, but not noticed. "You work for the Hartley agency," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He looked at me for a moment, then he stepped into the kitchen, not toward me, but to the counter along the far wall, where he opened a cabinet with the ease of someone entirely at home. Which, I understood slowly, he was. This was his residence. He filled a glass of water and stood with it, and looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as his thinking face. Still, unhurried, internal. "You could have told them you were unavailable," he said. "I didn't know this was your home until I arrived. And now that you know." "Now I know," I said carefully, "and I have 2 more hours of work before I'm finished." Something shifted in his expression, not the almost smile, something quieter than that. He set down his water glass and looked at the kitchen with the slightly abstracted gaze of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had already assessed. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The 2 weeks." I considered the question. "Disorienting," I said honestly. "In what way?" "I keep waiting for the limit," I said. Every time I make a purchase, some part of me expects the card to be declined, expects to hit the wall, and then it isn't there. And I stopped. Disorienting, I said again, because the word was accurate even if it was insufficient. He watched me with that quality of attention that made me feel simultaneously examined and, strangely, seen in a way that had nothing to do with scrutiny. "What have you bought?" he asked. The question was quiet, conversational in its surface, but I had learned in 6 days that Youngji's conversational surfaces were like that painting in the hallway, more layers underneath than the front revealed. "That's for the end of the 2 weeks," I said. His eyes moved over my face. "Yes," he said, "it is." He picked up his water glass and left the kitchen. I heard him move through the east study, and then a door closed somewhere distant in the apartment, and I stood beside the extraordinary counter in the extraordinary kitchen and pressed both palms flat against the cool surface and took several careful breaths. I finished my work in 2 hours and 7 minutes. On my way out, I passed the entry hall, and on the console table near the elevator, I noticed something that had not been there when I arrived. A small paper bag, the kind from a bakery. On it, a single word written in a handwriting that was precise and slightly angular. Ava. Inside, a coffee, still warm, and a pastry wrapped in wax paper. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then I took it, because refusing felt like a different kind of performance than accepting. And I had been in this man's orbit long enough to understand that performing indifference I did not feel was not the same as possessing it. The coffee was exactly the way I took it. I had told him nothing about how I took my coffee. I had not been back to the townhouse since that first morning, which meant he had noticed at the dinner 2 weeks prior the cup I had been given and barely touched. And he had remembered. A man who notices what you take in your coffee and files it away for later is either very considerate or very deliberate, and I was not yet certain which of those things was more unsettling. The second week moved differently than the first. My mother arrived on a Thursday, smaller than I remembered and more tired around the eyes, and when she stepped through the arrival gate and saw me, she did something she had not done in years. She stopped walking and just looked at me, the way you look at something you have been worried about and are relieved to find intact. We did not talk about the card. I had described it only as a work arrangement, a temporary provision, vague enough to be technically true. What I told her instead was, "You are here, and there is nothing to manage this week, and we are going to simply be in the same place for a few days." We walked in the park. We found a restaurant she liked, nothing expensive. She was suspicious of expensive. She ordered the soup and was delighted by it. We sat in my apartment in the evenings, and she fixed the hem on 2 of my work blouses that I had been meaning to address for months, and I sat across from her and watched her hands and felt the specific ache of loving someone you do not see enough. On her 3rd evening, she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Ava, what is happening with you?" "What do you mean?" "I mean something is different. You seem—" She searched for the word. Pulled in 2 directions. I looked at my hands. "There's someone," I said, which was both the most honest and least complete sentence I could construct. She was quiet for a moment. "Someone good?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I think he might be. In a way that doesn't make immediate sense." She considered this with the patience of a woman who has learned that pressing daughters rarely yields more than closing them. "Be careful," she said finally. Not a warning exactly. Something more like, remember who you are while you figure out who he is. 3 days after my mother flew home, I received a message from Youngjae's number. 2 weeks is tomorrow. I sat on my bed and read it 3 times, and then typed back, "I know." 3 minutes passed. Come at 9. I set the phone face down on the mattress and lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about what I had written in my notepad that first night, what I had bought, what it meant. What I was going to walk into that townhouse and say, and whether the saying of it would change something between us that I was only beginning to understand, had been changing regardless. My phone buzzed once more. This time it wasn't a message. It was a photograph. Taken, I realized after a disoriented moment, from a car on a street I recognized. My street. My building's entrance, visible in the background. No message attached. No explanation. Just the image, and the understanding it carried. That he had been there, outside, in a car I had not noticed, watching the building the way people watch things they are not ready to approach directly. I pressed the phone to my chest and lay in the dark and thought, this man is dangerous in every way I already knew, and in at least one way I didn't. The ceiling told me nothing useful. Morning was 9 hours away. I did not sleep well. The kind of sleeplessness that is not about insomnia, but about a mind that refuses to stop moving, turning things over the way hands turn stones on a riverbed, examining the underneath, replacing, turning the next one. I lay in the dark and thought about the photograph, about a black car on my street, idling in the cold, containing a man who controlled rooms without raising his voice, and remembered how strangers took their coffee, and had sent me a picture of my own building with no explanation attached, as though the explanation was the photograph itself. I thought about what that meant. I had spent enough of my life around powerful men. Not men like Young Jay, not that particular species of quiet authority, but powerful in the ordinary ways. The ways that express themselves in dismissal and assumption, to understand the difference between a man who watches because he wants to possess and a man who watches because he cannot stop himself. The first kind is a warning. The second kind is something more complicated. I was not certain yet which one Young Jay was, and the uncertainty itself was information. At 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with my notepad. The page I had written on that first night. One question at the top, one answer below it. I read the answer again, and it still seemed true, and the fact that it still seemed true after 2 weeks of having every financial door thrown open before me was, I suspected, precisely the point. I showered and dressed carefully. Not the charcoal coat this time, a deep burgundy one I had owned for 4 years, and saved for occasions that required feeling armored. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. Brown skin, dark eyes, the small gold hoops I wore every day, my mother's face in parts of mine, a woman who had been cleaning other people's beautiful things, and who had been handed, briefly, a key to something she did not fully understand, and had used it the way she used everything, practically quietly, with her family at the center of the calculation. I picked up the black card from the nightstand. I held it one last time. Then I put it in my coat pocket and went to Harwick Place. The same man opened the door. The same dark floors, the same museum painting, the same smell of cedarwood that I had by now associated so completely with this house that encountering it elsewhere would have felt like a minor haunting. I was shown to the same sitting room, but this time there was no 11-minute wait. Young Jay was already there, standing at the window with his back to the room, looking at the quiet street below. He turned when I entered. Dark trousers again, a black shirt today, sleeves rolled to the elbow in that way that had become familiar, the ink on his forearms visible, the deliberate informality of it, which I had come to understand was its own kind of armor. His eyes moved over me with that unhurried attention and settled on my face. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. A man who gives directions the way weather moves, without consultation. I sat. The coffee was already on the table, 2 cups, both fresh. I wrapped my hands around mine and waited. He remained standing for a moment, which told me something about his state of mind. Youngji seated was Youngji fully in control of a situation. Youngji standing was Youngji still navigating one. Then he sat, in the chair across from me, and rested his forearms on his knees, and looked at me steadily. "The other 4 women," he said. "Do you want to know what they bought?" I considered. "Only if it's relevant to what you're about to tell me." Something shifted in his expression, that quality of recalibration I had seen before. "It is," he said. He listed them without consulting anything, which meant he had been carrying the information in his head, which meant it mattered to him in a way that went beyond data collection. The woman in red had spent heavily on herself. Clothing, travel deposits, a jewelry purchase that had required its own appointment. Nothing illegal, nothing cruel. Simply the honest expression of a woman who had been waiting for permission to want things openly. The woman in white had transferred a significant sum to a separate account within the first 48 hours. An account linked, his people had determined, to a man who was currently the subject of a financial investigation connected peripherally to Youngjae's own operations. She had not spent the money. She had moved it. As a gift, or a warning, or a message. That part remained unclear, but the action itself was clear enough. The young woman in emerald had purchased almost nothing. A book. A meal at a restaurant she had described to a friend, in a phone conversation his team had monitored, as the nicest place she had ever eaten alone. She had withdrawn a modest amount of cash and given it, in an envelope, to a shelter 2 neighborhoods from where she lived. Then she had called the number she had been given for questions, and said quietly that she did not think this arrangement was right for her, and she would like to return the card. The 4th woman, the one whose table had sat empty, had never appeared. She had been the connection Youngjae most needed to examine, and her absence had been, itself, its own answer. I listened to all of this without speaking. "And the 5th card," he said. He looked at me. "What did you buy, Ava?" I set my coffee cup down. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the card on the table between us, the way he had placed it 2 weeks ago, and then I opened my coat and produced the notepad. My small, ordinary notepad, slightly bent from living in various pockets, and I found the page and slid it across to him. He looked down at it. At the top. What do I actually need? Below it, in my handwriting, for my mother to rest, for my grandmother to be seen by the right doctor, for the people I love to have what they need while I cannot provide it at the scale they deserve. And below that, a list. Itemized, dated, receipted. I had kept every confirmation. The plane ticket, the hotel, the caregiver, the specialist appointment, the car payment, the radiator part. A winter coat for my grandmother because she had mentioned being cold, and I had remembered it for 2 months before I had the means to act. At the bottom of the list, one final item, dated 4 days ago. One dinner. For my mother and me. At the restaurant she chose. Soup, she said, was the best she'd ever had. $34 including tip. Youngjae read the page. He read it slowly, the way he did everything, without rushing, giving each thing its full weight. His expression did not perform anything. It simply changed, the way light changes when a cloud shifts, something opening in it that had been closed before. He set the notepad down. The room was very quiet. "The card still has its limit," he said. "You spent less than 1% of what was available." "I spent what was needed," I said. "There's a difference." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "The woman in white. Her connection to that account puts her in proximity to people who have been working against my organization for 8 months. She will be managed." He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama. And I understood that managed covered a range of possibilities I did not need specified. The woman in red, I have no grievance with. She is honest about what she wants. That is worth something. He paused. The young woman in emerald returned her card. "You mentioned." "I'm going to make sure she's looked after," he said. "She doesn't know that yet." Something about the way he said it, the complete absence of expectation that it would be noticed or credited, made me understand something about him that the 2 weeks had been building toward without my full awareness. He was not a simple man. He was not a good man. Not in any uncomplicated sense. The security team and the monitored phone calls and the quiet way he said managed made that unambiguous. But he was not solely what his world suggested either. There was something interior to him that operated by its own code, strict and private, and entirely his own. Ava. He said my name the way he had the first night, as a fact being placed carefully somewhere. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer carries no consequence either way. You can say no and walk out of here and return to your work, and this entire month will simply be a strange thing that happened once. My hands were still in my lap. I kept them there. Ask, I said. I would like to see you again. He said it plainly, without ornament or strategy, which was somehow more disarming than any practiced approach would have been. Not as an arrangement, not with cards or tests or structures around it. I would like to have coffee with you. Or dinner. In a place you choose. The room absorbed the sentence. I looked at him. At the dark eyes that were watching me with an attention that was nothing like calculation now, that had shed whatever professional distance it maintained in other contexts, leaving something more unguarded underneath. At the ink climbing his throat, which I had stopped seeing as decoration, and started seeing as the record of a life lived at the extreme edges of things. At the hands resting on his knees, still contained, and the effort that containment represented. You had someone watching my building, I said. He did not look away. Yes. Why? A pause. Longer than his usual pauses. Because I wanted to know you were safe, he said, and I had not yet found a way to ask that was appropriate. That is not an appropriate way either, I said. No, he agreed. It isn't. The honesty of it, uncalculated, unhidden, did something to the architecture of my resistance that I had not anticipated. I had prepared for deflection, for the smooth redirection of a man accustomed to managing other people's perceptions. I had not prepared for him to simply agree that he had overstepped and wait, without defense, for whatever I decided to do with that. You're dangerous, I said. Not an accusation, an acknowledgement. Yes, he said. Again, simply. The world you're in is not one I can ask you to enter, he said. I know what it is. I'm not asking you to come into it. I'm asking if you'll have coffee with me. Outside, a car moved slowly down the quiet street. The painting on the far wall held its light. The security man was somewhere in the building, present and invisible, and the city continued beyond the window. And I sat in a chair across from a man who was dangerous and honest about it, and had remembered how I took my coffee, and had stood outside my building in the cold, because he had not yet found a way to ask if I was all right. The card sat on the table between us, matte black, returned. I thought about my mother's voice. Be careful. I thought about the notepad page and what it had taken me 34 years to learn about what I actually needed. I thought about the woman I had seen in the mirror this morning, armored in burgundy, clear-eyed, tired of making herself smaller than the space she occupied. Coffee, I said. One coffee, somewhere I choose. The thing that moved across his face then was not the almost smile I had catalogued before. It was something fuller than that, something that arrived before he could contain it, and lasted 2 full seconds before the habitual composure returned. 2 seconds was, I was learning, a very long time in the economy of Young Jay's expressions. Somewhere you choose, he agreed. I stood and picked up my notepad and left the card on the table between us. As I moved toward the door, his voice reached me. Quiet, as always, carrying further than it should. Ava. I turned. The radiator, he said. Did they fix it? I stared at him. How do you know about the radiator? He looked at me with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing, and the silence itself was an answer I was not entirely sure I was ready to sit with. I walked out into the cold air of Harwick Place, with my pulse doing something irregular, and my mind turning over a question I already knew I would not be able to put down. How much had he been paying attention, and for how long? I chose a coffee shop in my neighborhood. This was deliberate. Not a provocation exactly, but a statement. The kind made without words, through geography. If Young Jae wanted to enter my world, even briefly, he would have to come to it. He would have to sit in a place where the chairs did not match, and the espresso machine was loud, and the woman behind the counter knew my order and called me by name, where nothing had been curated for the comfort of men who arrived in black cars with security details. He agreed without hesitation when I sent the address. He arrived 8 minutes early. I know because I was already there, in the corner seat I always took, and I watched him come through the door with the particular attention of someone who has been thinking about a person for 10 days and is now reconciling the thought with the reality. He was alone, or appeared to be. I looked past him at the street and identified the car idling half a block down and the man who had positioned himself near the window of the bookshop opposite, reading nothing. Not alone then, but making the effort to appear so, which I understood was its own concession. He folded himself into the chair across from me with the slight adjustment of a large, careful man navigating a space built for ordinary dimensions. And he looked around the coffee shop with that habitual environmental sweep, exits, occupants, sightlines, and then he looked at me, and something in his face settled. "You come here often," he said, not a question. He had noticed the woman behind the counter lift her chin in greeting when I arrived. "Every morning I'm not working," I said. "The coffee is better than it looks like it should be." His arrived. He had ordered at the counter, which had clearly required some internal negotiation on someone's part. A man like him standing in a queue, wallet appearing from a jacket that cost more than my monthly rent. And he wrapped both hands around the mug the way I had wrapped mine that first morning at the townhouse, and I recognized the gesture as something genuine rather than mirrored. People who hold hot cups like that are people who grew up needing the warmth. "Tell me something about yourself," I said. "That isn't about the other thing." He looked at me steadily. "The other thing. The part of your life I'm not going to ask about." A pause. Then, "I grew up in Incheon. My mother made doenjang jjigae every Sunday morning, which is a fermented soybean paste stew, and the smell of it still does something to me I cannot fully explain." He said it carefully, the way people say things they rarely say. "She died when I was 19. The Sunday morning smell has been difficult to encounter since then." The coffee shop was warm and slightly too loud, and the espresso machine hissed behind us. "I'm sorry," I said. "It was a long time ago." He turned his mug once. "What about you?" "My mother is alive," I said. "You've essentially already met her, through the card." Something moved in his expression, recognition, and beneath it, something that might have been moved, though he would not have named it that. "She came to visit." "She did. We had soup." I looked at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "I'll try," he said, which was more honest than of course would have been. "The radiator. My building. How long had you been paying attention before that dinner at Nobu?" He held my gaze without flinching. "The agency your staffing company contracts through has been on my radar for 14 months. You appeared in their records 8 months ago, when you took on a placement at a property connected to someone I was monitoring." He paused. "You were not the subject of interest. You were simply present in information I was already reviewing. But you noticed me." "I notice everything," he said. "It is a professional habit I cannot turn off. A beat. With most things. And with me?" He looked at me for a long moment. "With you," he said carefully. "It became something other than professional some time ago. I am aware that this is not a simple thing to hear. It wasn't. I sat with it, the way you sit with something heavy. Not because you mean to keep it, but because putting it down requires more than a single movement. The woman in white, I said, the one who moved the money. Is she safe? She is being managed carefully, he said, which I understood meant she was being removed from proximity to the situation rather than anything more permanent. I chose to understand it this way, because the alternative was a door I was not yet prepared to fully open. She made a choice with full awareness. The consequences are proportional. And the girl in emerald? His expression shifted into something quieter. She received an envelope last week, anonymous, enough to cover 6 months of her rent and her sister's tuition. He looked at his coffee. She has nothing to do with any of this. She was invited by mistake, through a connection that turned out to be less relevant than I thought. She deserved to leave clean. I looked at him. You did that already, before today. Yes, without telling me. You weren't owed the information, he said. I didn't do it for your knowledge of it. I was learning how he operated. Not for observation or credit, but according to an internal ledger whose accounting was entirely his own. It did not make him uncomplicated. It made him a specific kind of complicated, the kind that takes time to read and longer to trust. We stayed in that coffee shop for 2 hours. He told me about Incheon's harbor, how the light sits on the water there in a way that is distinct from any other water he has encountered since. I told him about my grandmother's voice when she is fully present, clear and sharp and full of opinions, and how those moments are becoming rarer and more precious in direct proportion to their rarity. He told me, briefly and without details, that he had built what he built because it was the only structure available to him at 19, grieving and alone in a city that had no use for grief. I told him that I had been invisible for so long that being seen clearly, by anyone, still produced a reflex to step back into shadow. He listened to this last part with particular attention. Don't, he said. Just that. Not an instruction exactly. Something quieter. A preference. Almost a request. Don't step back. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary morning, and the man by the bookshop turned pages he wasn't reading, and the car idled half a block down, and none of this was simple or clean, or without its complications. I knew what Youngjae was. I knew the weight of the world that moved around him, the shadow it cast, the way proximity to it changed the temperature of ordinary life. My mother's voice. Be careful. My own voice. From that first night. What do I actually need? What I needed had never been safety in the abstract. What I needed was to stop arranging myself around other people's comfort and disappearing into the arrangement. What I needed was to be known by someone who looked at the whole of me, the carefulness, the loyalty, the quiet stubbornness, the 34 years of placing others first, and did not find it inconvenient. After 2 hours, I said I had a shift that afternoon and needed to go. He walked me to the door of the coffee shop. Outside, on the pavement, the cold air arrived between us, and we stood for a moment in the particular suspension of people who have not yet determined the grammar of their goodbye. I want to see you again, he said. I know, I said. That isn't an answer. I know that too. He looked at me with those dark eyes and waited, which was something I had observed him do repeatedly. Wait, without filling the space, without maneuvering into it. A man who could be still. There are things about your life I won't be able to accept, I said. I don't know yet which ones or how many. I need to be honest about that. I know, he said. And there are things about mine, my family, my work, the life I've built in the space I have, that aren't negotiable. They don't change because of whoever you are. I wouldn't want them to, he said. And then, after a pause, with a precision that suggested he had thought about it, they are most of what I respect about you. The city went on around us. A woman passed with a stroller. The bookshop man turned another unread page. "Saturday," I said. "There is a market 2 streets from here. I go on Saturday mornings. You can come if you want." Something happened in his face. Full and unguarded, arriving before the composure could intercept it, lasting longer this time than 2 seconds. "Saturday," he agreed. I walked back toward my building. I did not look back, though I felt his gaze on me with that same quality it always carried. Total, unhurried, the attention of a man who has filed you somewhere important and does not intend to lose track of you. At the corner, I stopped, because something had occurred to me. I turned. He was still there, on the pavement outside the coffee shop, watching me with his hands in his jacket pockets and the cold air around him and the quiet street behind him, exactly as still as he always was, as though the city moved and he simply remained. I thought about a matte black card, heavier than it looked. A notepad page. Soup at $34, including tip. A photograph of my building sent in the dark by a man who did not yet have appropriate language for concern. A radiator, finally fixed. My mother's hands, hemming my blouses in a warm kitchen. I thought about the woman I had seen in the mirror, armored, clear-eyed, done with disappearing. I raised one hand. A small gesture, an acknowledgement. He raised one in return, equally small, equally precise. Then I turned the corner and walked home through the cold morning, and I was not the same woman who had stood on a pavement 10 days ago, reading 3 lines from an unknown number. I knew this not because anything dramatic had shifted, but because of something far quieter. Because for the first time in longer than I could honestly account for, I was walking toward my own life instead of maintaining someone else's, and the difference felt exactly like what it was. Like finally, after years of moving through rooms like a ghost, taking up the space that had always been mine to take. The city held me in its ordinary noise. Somewhere behind me, a black car pulled slowly away from the curb. And somewhere ahead, a Saturday was coming. A market, 2 streets from my building, where nothing was arranged and nothing was tested, and 2 people would simply be in the same place at the same time, choosing it. That was enough. I was learning exactly enough.